makings of a science fiction novel. It was an ordinary February day when in the wee hours of the morning, Mother Nature opened her jaws, the floor gave way, and 8 prized Corvette automobiles were never to be seen again as they were. The recovery and repair is underway, but the question for those of us living on this karst terrain remains: how vulnerable are we to the unpredictability of Mother Nature and these things we call sinkholes? On the program today, we're going to dispel some of the secrets about sinkholes. In addition, find out more about our vulnerability here on this karst terrain as we talk with Katie Frassinelli, the Communications Director at the National Corvette Museum. In addition, we'll talk with a geologist and an engineer who were early on the scene at the Corvette Museum sinkhole and talk about using this inconvenience as a means to learn more about Mother Nature's vulnerability. Kentucky Outlook is next.
So our staff get a call about 5:44 a.m. on Wednesday, February 12th, and the burglar alarm apparently had been going off in the museum. And so she gets up, and she only lives a couple of minutes from here, and comes in, and another staffer has gotten to work at the same time. And so they enter the building together, and they see what they think is smoke, and they smell, just some unusual smells, and look and see that there's a big hole in the floor. So they call the fire department, and the fire department comes and secures the scene. And our facilities manager and executive director, they all arrive on scene and are kind of like, what do we do? You don't usually have sinkholes in the middle of buildings, and much less swallow Corvettes. So called Scott Murphy and Daniel Construction, because they had done the expansion of the building in 2009. And they kind of advised on, okay, here's what you need. You need a structural engineer, maybe some geologists, a geotechnical engineer, and then of course Scott Murphy and Daniel came. So this team arrives within hours and just start assessing the situation, secure the area. The museum closed for tourists just on that Wednesday and reopened on the following day, Thursday. And Western Kentucky University, they were able to send their engineering team, who had a sort of drone helicopter where they flew into the sinkhole to kind of see what was going on in there. And that footage was invaluable to the construction crews to kind of know where the cars were, where the voids were. The Geology department from WKU also came, and so their expertise was also very helpful in telling, okay, you've got a cave under here, here's what happened, looking at, is the building safe? Luckily, with it being in the Sky Dome, this is kind of a separate building from the museum. It is attached, but they weren't worried about anything happening to the rest of the building. So had some surveyors come, and they've been continually monitoring the museum and the grounds just to make sure we don't have any further shifting or anything else that's going to go on.
And a very special thanks to Katie Frassinelli, the Communications Director with the National Corvette Museum. Since we recorded that interview, they have recovered all of the 8 Corvette automobiles that were swallowed into the sinkhole. Not the way they looked when they went in, but we're going to talk more about that and our vulnerability to sinkholes as we welcome to the program from WKU's Geology Department, Dr. Mike May. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
In addition, we are joined by Matt Dettman, who I'm laughing because you were talking about the fact that when you got the call about the sinkhole, you were on your way to another sinkhole.
Yes, I was.
So share that with us. You're with the engineering department at WKU, and you were one of the first on the scene.
Yes, that morning I was actually scheduled to go look at another sinkhole in a residential subdivision. And so I was getting ready to go out there, and had heard some of the talk about a sinkhole at the Corvette Museum, and I hadn't heard the size or scope of that particular sinkhole. And then more and more information started to come in, and then calls were coming into the university, and they said, you probably need to go out there. Someone with this much experience in sinkholes, you probably need to go out there. So I diverted my path to the Corvette Museum. And when I got there, shocking because of the location and because the fact that there are Corvettes down there. But looking from a purely geotechnical standpoint, it doesn't really look that much different than most other sinkholes we see in this area.
However, the scope and the magnitude, once you get there and eyeball it,
it's pretty dramatic.
It's pretty dramatic.
Being inside a building, had that been in the middle of a field, that would have been just a typical sinkhole because the expanse of the outdoors makes it appear smaller. Of course, the confines of an enclosed space certainly makes it look much larger. But the location of it, the timing of it was extremely fortunate. It could have been much worse. And the uniqueness of the location made an extremely unique event.
Well, you know, and if one wants to look for the positive in all of this, and I like the way you looked at it when we talked before the interview, you know, a lot of people are calling it a tragedy. You prefer to call it an inconvenience. A tragedy would have been, as you pointed out, if there had been human beings who had been lost.
Yes, as we know, the Corvette Museum is host to lots of people, lots of groups, children's groups, Corvette aficionados, and that room is full of people most of the time. And so I don't like to call it a tragedy because nobody died, there's no loss of life. And I've been involved in tragic events. I was in California during the Loma Prieta earthquake, and a significant loss of life. And in this case, we lost some vehicles, but it's inconvenient. They have to repair it, they have to rebuild it. Had there been loss of life, then it would have been a severe tragedy.
Mike May, you know about these kinds of things, you study them. Help us understand when we say we live on karst, what are we talking about?
We live on fairly unstable land that has over 1 million or more years has constantly been transformed. We have a dissolving of the bedrock, and that bedrock goes somewhere in the form of what we call dissolved load. Basically, the rock dissolves and it goes out into an underground conduit or stream system, and that will move out of the way, so we're losing volume of rock or earth material below our feet, and many times that rock volume is replaced by soil or weathered zones of rock, and that will cover in some of these sink areas. And so the land sinks down, continues to wash down, and the main vulnerability we have is the fact that we get about 4 feet of rain a year, precipitation, and so as long as we have a continuous a wetting and moving of fluids and unfortunately soil with that water, it's a process called soil piping. And as the water goes, so does the soil in those sinkholes, and that's how we have these collapses. About 95 or even more than that % of the subsidence and sinking down of foundations, sidewalks, buildings, and all that is really aggravated by drainage that we might have a hand in the way that we design our buildings and our drainage around buildings and streets and that nature.
Not to sound alarmist, but before we got started with the interview, we do live, and people probably need to realize this, not in a higher risk area, but you said we live in a high risk area.
Yes, that's the Kentucky Geological Survey actually has a service where you can create an interactive map of a karst geohazard potential is what we call it. And if you're looking at a map as far as color-coded, areas that are red are going to be a red flag. And if you do that in the Warren County area, about half of the southern portion of Warren County is red, and which includes most of Bowling Green. That's because the limestones that are exposed at or near the surface, they are quite vulnerable to being dissolved and forming sinkholes and underground streams, and springs and collapse zones go along with it. We see a topography, surface of the land goes up and down, and sometimes we fill those areas thinking that we have a nice flat building area, and then we have a drainage situation where the water will then go around an area that has been filled. And it's kind of like looking at a downspout problem on a house. It may seem like a small thing at the time, but after a number of years, you continue to create that flow of water down along a foundation, and then Matt can tell you get calls all the time, people saying, "Oh, my house is sinking," or "My sidewalk is crooked," or "Where this manhole cover was, where this utility trench is, it's like everything going up and down." And indeed, it's a land on the move, basically.
Whew. Now, the big question here is, could this situation in particular at the Corvette Museum have been averted, or could in general issues with sinkholes be averted if we had a better means of detecting when they might occur?
That's possible. And the day I was out there and seeing what happened, and the fact that the sinkhole occurred underneath the building, and we don't see that a lot. That does happen. There have been some instances prior to this that it has happened.
But why do we not see that a lot?
Well, it's because if you look at the vast, square miles of land and the amount of that's covered with buildings, the higher percentage is just land, and so they'll just open up anywhere. And the odds of them opening up under a building are fairly low. But the fact is that now that we're expanding Bowling Green more, we're seeing more construction. People think we're getting more and more sinkholes. Like, well, we probably aren't. We're just covering more and more of the land. And so what did happen out in someone's field is now happening under a building that we built on top of that. And so the number of reported sinkholes is probably rising because we're expanding.
Sure.
We're building over these areas. And so when I saw the Corvette Museum and know of other cases where this has happened inside buildings, I started thinking, and it's one of those things where I stayed up all night thinking there's got to be something we can do. There's got to be a way to detect that, because I know how these sinkholes form. They start at the bedrock surface, and that soil starts to wash, as Mike was talking about, wash down into the cave system, and you have this void that is slowly creeping towards the surface. And so I thought there's got to be a way to detect that void prior to it reaching all the way to the concrete slab level, because we don't have X-ray vision. We can't see through that. And I also received calls that day from other industries saying,
panicked, I'm sure. Do we have
air under our slab? We know we have sinkholes down there. Do we have air under our slab? And do we have air under our very expensive equipment? And do we have air under our workers? And so I had an idea, and I went to the office the next day and talked to my colleague Ron Rizzo. I had the idea, he can build anything. So I said, Ron, here's my idea. Here's what I want to do. Can you build this? And he said, yes, we can build it. And so I brought the prototype here today. We have a few. We've done some exterior installations to practice. And how this device works is if there's air under your slab, this device is set where this is at the top of the slab, and we can put it in existing construction or in new construction. And so, they can go we can build these things deeper, so we can detect that air void at the deepest possible point. And so
now, when you say, 80 feet, it turns out the sinkhole, my understanding, underneath the Corvette Museum goes 80 feet.
It's pretty deep. We probably wouldn't go that deep. What I would do during an investigation would be determine what's the depth to bedrock, and I would probably want to about split that difference. If bedrock is 40 feet, I might want to go 20 feet, maybe a little bit less, to split that difference, because at that point the void has gotten big enough. It's hard to pick the peak of the void because it's sort of a cone shape, and so I want to get enough time to detect any part of that void. And so once that void approaches the bottom of this, and there's air under there, and then the weight drops, and then the device triggers. And so there's a warning there, and it's a little bit sudden, but at this point, when that thing is triggered, it's a visible trigger. We wanted to make it small, and that tip will break off if someone kicks it, so it's not a trip hazard. And we can rig this up to have lights in it, or even have a buzzer on it.
Or something.
But the point here is that it will trigger, but it will give someone plenty of time. It's not like once it triggers, you're in
done.
imminent danger of collapse. At that point, you can deal with the void. You can say, we've got a problem here. And so then we would come out, we would remove the device, and then we could visibly see down into the hole, put a downhole camera down there and determine what we've got. And then we can address it prior to some sort of catastrophic event, loss of life or loss of machinery, loss of equipment.
When you say address it, and I understand, was it you that put the drone cameras in the sinkhole in the Corvette Museum?
That was the mechanical engineering students.
Okay.
Joel Lenore had, one of our mechanical engineering professors, had a group of students that did this for a project, and when the sinkhole came up and they thought, hey, actually there's a practical application here. And so they took it out there and did get some footage down in the sinkhole, which proved to be pretty valuable. Okay,
so you've got this now. You have an emergency patent, or?
We've got a provisional patent, so we can officially use the term patent pending. We've spoken with a couple local industries. They're very interested in this product, because we can do investigations. They talked to me, called me and said, can we do an investigation to determine if we have sinkholes? I said, yes, we can. So working with some colleagues, we put together, here's what that would cost. But the more we talked about it, we said, I can tell you that you have the potential for sinkholes just without doing any investigation.
Right.
And they said, yeah, that's true. So what we really want to know is, we know we have sinkholes. How can we tell if we've got this void? And so now we have an answer. Is it the best answer? I don't know. It's an answer right now, and we've evolved this thing 3 or 4 times already, and it will continue to evolve as we install them. So we're working on that right now, and we're hoping.
With Western, kind of working in conjunction with Western?
Working through Western and working with these local industries, and we haven't figured out all those details yet. But we do. People are interested. And they want to know. They want to know right now. They don't want to wait till another one happens. So.
Do you think it could be one day like we have radon detectors now in our homes, that we could do a sinkhole detector somehow, some way?
Sure. I often compare it to a smoke detector. And everybody has one of those. And we've presented this to a few people, and we're getting a lot of interest from residential. I said, can I put one of those in my garage? Can I put one in my house? I've got this little hole back here. Can I put it between my house and the hole to determine? So we're seeing a broad market for it, and we're talking with insurance companies to figure out. They're not really sure how to handle it quite yet.
To be determined. Karen, if you would, we've got some photographs that are, I think, they speak volumes, and especially the Dettman Lane, when the road collapsed. When you can see, to see a hole, a sinkhole, a small, okay, but when you see what's at the Corvette Museum, or you see Dettman Lane, and that was 12 years ago.
Right.
When the road just gave way due to a sinkhole. So, we are at risk to a certain extent. You could be driving along, walking along, and you just never know when it's going to happen unless you have some way to detect it.
That's right.
If indeed the alarm goes off, and you said you could send down cameras and things to investigate, could you mitigate? Is there a way to do that?
We can mitigate. We have various methods now. With a sinkhole that we find just out in the middle of a field, while a building is under construction or while we're investigating, it's a fairly simple fix. We will excavate the sinkhole, and then we will repair it with what we call an inverted drain, with large rock down to smaller rock, but we also wrap that rock with filter fabric. And as Mike was talking about, with the soil filters down into the cave system, the filter fabric doesn't allow the soil to migrate down into the cave system, but it allows the sinkhole to what I call breathe. Sinkholes, they take water, and water also backs up into them during heavy rains and high water times. So we want the sinkhole to still do what it does naturally. And so this inverted drain method allows the water to still flow, but stabilizes the ground, so we don't have any sort of collapse. And those are frequent. There is a sinkhole being repaired probably today somewhere in Bowling Green. This is an everyday thing. Underneath existing buildings, we will stabilize the foundation with what we call micropiles or push piles or helical piles, but we will attach brackets to the foundation and push these micropiles down into the ground until they get resistance, where they start lifting the building back up. And some of the pictures I brought show just a house. You can see the void underneath the house, and they were concerned it was a sinkhole, and so I went out there. Sure enough, it was. Called the foundation repair company, and they are rapid response. So they were on site within an hour and a half. And they were putting these piles in within 2 hours. Because
there's really no way to, if indeed you detect a sinkhole, there's really no way to say that, oh, you've got an hour before the whole house goes down. It's nature.
It's nature. There's no real way to detect that. And they're very difficult to detect before you see any sort of subsidence or any sort of dropping. They're very difficult to detect. And we have methods to do that, but those are also very expensive. It would put it beyond the price of a typical homeowner. Even these large industries take a little bit of pause. And so the best, what I think now with my experience in dealing with these things is repair them if you find them before construction. If you don't find them, then my recommendation now would be to install some sort of early warning system, which this is, in your mission critical areas. If it's just a warehouse, you probably don't need them. because you might see some cracking and some things. But if you have mission critical areas where life safety is an issue or some of your more expensive equipment is located, then I believe we can detect them before
sooner
they
rather
cause
than later.
serious damage.
Now, are we, geographically, is Bowling Green in this area of Kentucky unique in the whole United States, in the whole world, or are there other parts of this universe that have these things as well?
No, there's about 55% of Kentucky is karst. And there's actually 4 types of karst in Kentucky, not to make it complicated, but we live in what's called the Western Pennyroyal, which is pretty much well-developed sinkholes, things of that nature. There's the Eastern Pennyroyal, and there's the Pine Mountain karst, which is in southeast Kentucky in the mountains. It's quite different. And then most importantly, around the Lexington areas, because you have about 1/3 people there, they have what's called the inner bluegrass or the bluegrass karst. Their sinkholes aren't as big and deep. There tends to be interbedded, muddy or clay-rich deposits in between. So they have still some of the problems that we have here of groundwater contamination, surface water going in and washing the soil down, and things of that nature. But one of the things Matt was saying I'd like to talk about, how we're not unique, is that sinkholes have various dimensions, and if you look at something like this, you can see that this is actually a piece of limestone right here on the WKU campus that shows square sinkholes and big round or kind of inundated or embayed or straight, like that could be like Lost River Cave. And so what you have is a whole series of different geometries, and so the rock dissolves, and to predict the nature of those, its geometry, it's so varied that you can't really tell. But we do have ways of detecting. Matt was showing an early warning system here, but if you have money, if you're a big company, you can do all kinds of geophysical surveys like microgravity. In fact, Dettman Lane, we did some profiles pre and post collapse, and we knew that there was a cave down there. We knew the size of it. There's another thing called electrical resistivity tomography, or ERT.
But no tests later on that, right?
No. And then
But
another one. Yeah, another one. So it basically tells you that the rock and the soil have 2 different electrical properties, like it conducts electricity, or it's resistive to that, to conducting electricity. And the soil and the rock interface can be looked at. Okay, we don't have X-ray vision, but if we have 2 or 3 geophysical techniques, we can look at anomalies. And the microgravity, for instance, just believe it or not, it tells a small difference between you and the center of the Earth and the gravitational pull. If there's a hole between you and the center of the Earth, you will be able to detect that.
Oh, wow.
So we go along a line and do that. But it isn't magic. We'll have to take lines across the building site. There are a lot of people around the Corvette Museum. In fact, I've gotten a few calls of people saying, we think we have a sinkhole, and can we do surveys? And I said, yes, we can. And so electrical resistivity tomography, and also some seismic, bouncing energy off the bedrock. And so there is a way, but it costs money, thousands of dollars, and so most residential people, they won't want to deal with that.
They just can't afford to do that. And there was some talk at the Corvette Museum. They're in the process of building a motorsports area on the property near there. And there was some talk that perhaps the movement of the earth on that side of the property may have contributed to what happened. And the stories just start to fly, don't they, when things like this happen? Yeah. You're not commenting on that.
They do. I can comment. I think that's one of those debates that we never will really know. I think there will be some that will say, yes, all that activity may have contributed. I might be on the other side of that argument, and Mike and I have talked about this at length. But that sinkhole didn't start that day. That sinkhole ended that day. That sinkhole began far before the Corvette racetrack began construction, started far before the idea of the racetrack started. Is it conceivable that it may have sped it up by a few days, weeks, months? I don't know. For me right now at this point, I'm like, well, I'm glad that it sped it up, because it sped it up to a point where it happened exactly when it did, which was the best possible time that it could have occurred. So I would say that I'd be thankful they were doing that if it caused it to occur right at that moment, because there was no loss of life.
No loss of life, no doubt. We're quickly running out of time. Before we get away, people watching, you know, as I say, if you're watching this, you're on karst terrain as we speak, not to be alarmist, but what kind of precautions can you take to be prepared? Because if you saw the visuals at the beginning of the show and you saw that sinkhole at the Corvette Museum, if you were standing there, guess what? Chances are there wouldn't have been much you could do. But what can we do precautionary-wise as human beings living on a karst terrain to be safe?
The residential areas, people's houses, my recommendation always has been, I'm sure Matt's is as well, it's about drainage. You know, if we know we're vulnerable, we can either, as he just said, we can either speed things up or slow things down. And as the water goes, so does the soil, unless you have the filter fabric there. And if you have a downspout right by your foundation, you're kind of asking for trouble. And it's like people saying, well, we lived by this river for 40 years and it hasn't flooded. But when it does, you know, that could be the big one. Same with earthquakes, you know, where we know we're in a potentially vulnerable location. So how do you assess risk? We know we're in a high risk area. So drainage is paramount. You have to know, you know, that your water has to be conveyed or moved away from your house. That's pretty safe. Also, people look at this as only an issue of something that's catastrophic. Some of it can be very slow. Mm-hmm. You still get foundation damage, again, related to drainage. We see it all over town. And Matt may want to make a comment about some of the ways that maybe we could improve our infrastructure too, and you know, that has to do with drainage.
Like they do in some areas, they have earthquake-safe buildings. We could maybe have sinkhole-safe buildings.
There are things we can do. The biggest thing I think we can do now is most sinkholes that I see open up in developed areas, you'll see a utility line running through them, a water line, a gas line. So when we build utility lines, we excavate the soil, we put some stone in there, we lay the pipe, and we backfill it with some more stone and put some soil on top of it or pave over top of it. And so what we've created is a channel. So that gravel is highly porous, and water just flows through those channels. The night that Dettman Lane collapsed, I was out there, and it was a large water line right on the far side of the sinkhole, but you could see it. It had failed. They turned the water off, but water was pouring out of the gravel that the pipe was backfilled with. And so what happens is these utility lines, they start to catch a lot of this water. Now you've got a stream flowing where you had rainwater just percolating down. Now you've got a river of water flowing in a specific area. Now once that river of water that's passing through that channel hits one of these arches or one of these sinkholes, it's going to flow straight down, and it's going to speed that process up dramatically. And so we can change the way we construct these trenches. We can use a product called flowable fill, which is easy to dig, easy to excavate, but very low permeability, does not allow water to pass. And one thing I would add to Mike and his discussion of residential areas is I would be familiar with your property. That's what I tell homeowners. Just keep an eye on it. If you see a depression, take a picture of it. You know, walk your property every so often, just be familiar with your land. If you see anything's different, document it, and then come back in a few months, document it again.
Keep an eye.
Keep an eye on it.
Really good advice. Come back in a couple months, we'll see how things are progressing, right? We're talking about the secrets of sinkholes with Dr. Mike May and Matt Dettman of WKU's Engineering and Geology Department. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Kentucky Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us.